Muslin's been a part of our heritage for a very long time.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to this event tonight. My name is Mohammed Ahmedullah. I'm the Secretary of Brickland Circle, and today is the first day of the 10th anniversary of Bengal History Week. I just quickly tell you how the Bengal History Week started. Back in 2007 was 250th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey, and we organized some activities, conference, and Nick over there organized work for us, East India Company work. He does East India Company works. And then we came up with a project and we applied for funding, and we were lucky we got funding to run a project called Battle of Plassey Young People's Project. Basically, we wanted to engage young people to study research about East India Company in East London, because a lot of people, this was open for everybody, but this area has large Bangladeshi population, and East India Company headquarters and most of its operations were done from this area, and the first place that they conquered in the Indian subcontinent was Bengal. So it was really strange that they ruled Bengal from here first, and then the rest of India. And this place has the largest Bangladeshi population in this country, and very few people knew hardly anything about the roads and the streets and the buildings, right? Which once belonged to East India Company, or East India Company goods moved from the docks, dock area to warehouses and so on. So anyway, the project completed. We had 8 young people, aged 18 to 25. And one of the girls, she said, we learned so much from this project. Why don't we have an annual Bengal History Week? So that's why we started in 2010. And we've been doing this for every year. And today is also the launch of launch day of Bengal History Week. And you can see the topic is all about Muslin, and we've got some people here who have done a lot of work on this. I will just say one thing before I pass on to the speakers, is that when East India Company started, this is all about textile. And the largest, at one time, or for a long period, from around, I think, when was it, 1720s until 1760, 2/3 of East India Company imports were from Bengal, and largest amount were from, were textile, right? And a variety of textiles were imported by East India Company. But when East India Company started, they didn't go to India to buy textiles. They went to India to buy textile after the Dutch kicked them out, from the Spice Islands and Indonesia, where the spice places were. Because they couldn't compete with the Dutch went in bigger numbers and earlier, and they were more determined to take over, because those days, spice were very expensive in Europe, especially nutmeg and mace and cloves. So the English actually couldn't compete, and they lost the spice war, against the Dutch. And the English were also looking for markets, for woolen clothes. And in places like Indonesia, they didn't want to buy, woolen clothes, but they were interested in Indian textiles. So that's why the English went to India to get the textiles, then to sell the textiles in the Indonesian archipelago and buy spices from there. So that's how they got some contact with the Indian textiles. And then subsequently, that's where they kind of developed most of their business interest by importing Indian textiles. So we have 3 speakers, Sonia, Rezia, and Nick. They've all helped us over the years, and they have done a lot of work in the field. And Saif, you will see the video, and Saif will introduce, he'll talk about the project and his journey and introduce the film. But I'll pass on to Sonia now.
Good evening, thanks for coming. Can we have the slide show? Won't be a very long talk, but Mohammed asked me to talk about how I investigated Muslin. So this is sort of a personal story about that. So go to the next slide. My investigation led to, can you all hear? Yeah. Led to a book that was published by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2012, now out of print, along with a number of other V&A books. It was written to explain and understand the V&A's collections of South Asian and European muslins, so it had a very broad scope. It was the first attempt to cover the subject since 1851, I discovered, except for a catalogue of an exhibition. Inevitably, there are mistakes and omissions, and I'm very aware of them. There was no one to ask and no budget to do anything other than basic research. So that's my excuse, and partly I was trying to cover a vast amount of territory that I'd never anticipated when I started. But as I say, I'm learning all the time, so if I wrote it again, it would be a better book. The next one, please. First of all, Muslin is a worldwide story. Starts in, I refer to Bengal, undivided Bengal historically, which obviously we now mean West Bengal and Bangladesh, but it actually covered a much bigger area during the British period and earlier. So from this point in South Asia, Muslin covered Europe and the world to some extent, and even went as far as the Americas. So it's a huge, geographically a very widespread story. Next one, please. But for me, this is where it started, in these rather uninspiring storerooms in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the old storerooms. They've since moved, and they're going to move again. I went to work on a project on sort of to understand the museum's collections of Indian, South Asian textiles, of which they have some 10,000 objects. And they said, well, you better go and have a look at what's there. So for weeks, if not months, I sort of spent down here opening drawers and seeing what was there. So next one, please. So this is where I was, somewhere in this huge labyrinthine building, which, as you know, has got sort of vast collections covering all sorts of topics. And the wonderful thing is there's lots of people to kind of cross-reference with different left-field subjects that you come across. So there's a lot of sort of information sharing if you want to do that. Next one. So you open the drawers and sort of out comes India, the smell of Asia actually, embedded in the textiles. This obviously isn't muslin. Next one. I found a lot of different white fabrics. And here's a few examples. They're not all fine. Handkerchiefs, tent cloths, sailcloths, towels, muslins, embroidered net, cotton, at the bottom, made from English thread, which we exported to India, and many, many more. So white is big, and that's beside all the coloured and embellished things. Next one. And then I discovered they had about 1,000 muslin objects in the collections. So what was this wonderful stuff? Where did it come from? What's its story? I had to find out because nobody seemed to know much about it. Next one. So I discovered that there were many different kinds of muslin, and it was put to many different uses. So here's a few of them. Perhaps the most refined, of which you can see examples on the wall over here from Saiful Islam's collections. Jamdani muslin, which is woven with a plain muslin woven with a supplementary weft, the design worked in by hand. Extremely time-consuming work, the skilled work. Embroidered muslin that we now know as shikan, which started probably in Bengal, but then West undivided Bengal, but then became an industry in Lucknow. Next one. Embroidered and embellished muslins from South India and Bengal, and this spotted type of muslin was very popular in the West. In people like, Jane Austen often refers to spotted muslins, not only in her novels, but her diaries. There was also a taste for spangly, shiny, embellished cloths in South India, such as the wonderful one on the right. Next one. There were also, South India tended to produce checked and striped, rather unfigurative designs in their muslins, and all their cloths actually. Next one. In North India you get block printed muslin, tie-dyed with, here with applied gold leaf as a turban cloth. Next one. And of course there were the garments, so they have, B&A has some of the most wonderful garments. This is the man's jama that was given to the museum by the Maharaja of Bharatpur, and it has 277 panels in the skirt, separate panels, and the circumference of the hem is 65 meters if you laid it on the ground. So that's a lot of muslin, so that would have been a very, very expensive garment because it was costly fabric. And on the right you have a beautiful gown made in the typical empire style to which muslin was very suited, made of Indian muslin. Sometimes it's hard to tell in the collection whether muslin dresses are of Indian fabric or British made muslin. This case we know it's Indian. Next one. So the point of this is that a cloth that was used for both men and women in India was tended to become a woman's garment. We used the women's garment in Europe. You wouldn't see it was just used for possibly frills and shirt cuffs and things for men. So this was the only book I could find that really told me much about muslin, apart from Hamida Hussein's very interesting work. So it was written by the commercial resident of Dhaka in 1851 to explain the muslin objects which were shown in the Great Exhibition in South Kensington. And interestingly enough, as you'll see, there were lots of detailed drawings of the different processes, and most of which really haven't changed very much today. So what you see here is really what's going on today. Next one. So apart from looking in the V&A, I went to the British Library, India Office Records, and tried to decipher the handwriting of the East India Company servants who'd worked in the sort of humid tropical conditions of Bengal in the 18th century and earlier, happily presided over by Mr. Rezia Khan, Minister to the Nawab of Oud, wearing a muslin robe, so that was rather encouraging. I also went to Kew, the herbarium, to see samples of the kind of cotton that would have been used for making muslin. I went to University of Manchester Library, amongst others, to look at records of British muslin manufacturers. Next one. I went up to Scotland to Paisley to discover that the Paisley handloom weavers had made a very passable imitation of different sorts of muslin. You can see on the right. Paisley more famous for its shawls. I went to Bolton, Lancashire, where they also wove what they call muslin, which was a much coarser sort of cloth. Next one. Eventually I got to West Bengal and tried to investigate things in the Botanical Survey of India. Didn't get terribly far, but they've got this wonderful model of cotton production in the museum there. And I went to see some weaving of Indian style, West Bengal style muslin, plain muslin and figured muslin, which was just sort of in its infancy at the time. But what you can see is a typical pit loom, where you sit at the level of the loom and your feet and legs go underground where you work the pedals. So that hasn't changed since the historic times. Next one. Eventually I also got to Bangladesh, thanks to Saiful Islam's Muslin Festival. And we visited weavers in their villages where they, again, examples of how the looms really are made of bamboo and wood, exactly the same kind of construction that they had in the probably 16th century, earlier, 17th, 18th, we only have illustrations from the 19th century, but certainly things haven't changed very much. Next one. So here, 19th century photograph of a typical Bengal village, and below, where I was 3 weeks ago or a month ago near Dhaka, where really apart from the materials used to make the weavers' houses, which is now more waterproof, really very little has changed again. And I'm not saying they were taken in the same place, but the similar sort of slightly tropical vegetation, very much surrounded by water, and very much part of the cotton at the time was a cotton growing area where they were able to produce, because of the sort of ecology of the area, a very particular type of cotton which was suited to muslin weaving. Next one. So, crucially, what is muslin? Muslin is a plain weave cotton fabric, so you just go basically over and under, over and under. You're not... Yes? Oh, okay. So it's not complicated in itself as a weave. Next one. Next slide. Oh. It was dependent on a particular type of cotton with a particular type of semi-short length fibre. This particular variety of cotton tree cotton only grew in this particular areas around Dhaka because of the soil type being, all the silt and so on being washed down the river, into the river delta there. And I won't go into the actual nature of the fibres, but they were very crucial to the actual net result of weaving this type of cotton. Next one. And I got it wrong in my book, so apologies, and it's a bit difficult to change it now, but I never believed secondary sources, is all I can say. I believed Roxburgh and I believed Kew Gardens, who had it wrong information. And I thought it was a different type of cotton, but we've now established what it was. So this map is to show the location of undivided Bengal up there, and it's the importance of this river delta system, which produces the particular kind of soil. Now the area is given over to rice growing. There's no cotton, very little cotton grown there now, but so the whole area is suited to rice growing as well. So they're very, very specific locations where this cotton was grown. Next one, and it was a kind of cottage industry, in that the cotton would be grown in the village, the family of the weavers and neighbours and the village people locally would process the cotton with very simple implements. So it was a sort of complete, contained little industry. Here are two 19th century muslins, on the left from Bengal and on the right from Hyderabad, South India, and the Deccan. And this is not an exaggeration, but I think you can see they're roughly the same, not quite the same magnification, but the Bengal muslin has a much looser, slightly more uneven weave. And so you get this this very kind of mossy, soft feeling that you don't get from the South Indian muslins. And I could show many other examples. And it was sort of measured sort of semi-scientifically to prove that actually the Bengal muslin is lighter, finer, and a more sophisticated sort of weave. So next one. The next thing I had to look into was the East India Company's enormous role in the production and marketing of cotton, of muslin, which I won't go into here. But this list of, they began to send huge cargoes out, and you could get something like 10,000 pieces of muslin lengths in one ship, because obviously it's very light. And they often call them book muslins, because you could fold them flat like paper, so you get an awful lot of muslin in one shipment. So where did it all go is the question. There's not very much of it left, so it must have been, they sold an awful lot of it, but we have relatively few examples left, so it must have been worn to pieces. But these are some of the different names, the many different names for different types of cotton and muslins, different finenesses and so on. So it was a very, very precise classification of all these different types of cotton and muslin, which the length of the list will indicate. They set up what they call factories, which weren't factories, they were more like sort of sorting warehouses, where all the finished muslins would be brought in from the villages and inspected and sorted and piled up and so on. And this is one of the English companies. There were other countries, the Dutch, the Danes and the French also had factories in Bengal. Next one. And this is the city that Muslin built, more or less Dhaka in the 19th century, a sort of great white European-looking city from the picture. Next one. And this is what happened when, for various reasons, which I don't have time to go in for, the whole thing collapsed. This is the remains of one of the European factories at Sonia. And here is one of the streets of merchants' houses in Painam, which is very picturesque, which was a 19th century trading centre, which you can still see today. Next one. And there was things like portraits were really useful. What was the connection between Shah Jahan wearing possibly muslin? There are many miniature Mughal paintings of people wearing transparent, often muslin garments, both men and women. So, what happened to this court patronage? Here you've got a sort of leader of the British East India Company dressed in a suit of armour of all things. You wouldn't have worn that in Bengal, it would have been a bit hot, I think. But nevertheless, his outfit is showing his power and the power of the company he works for, and the way that they control this textile industry. And on the right, you've got a British man who manufactured muslin in Manchester, and here he is with this roll of muslin, who was always very worried when the shipments came in from India, because it was going to sort of knock his business for six. Anyway, he made a lot of money and lost it because he invested it badly. But anyway, the connection between all these people is real and interesting. So next one, try not to spend too long. So what is the relevance of weavers in Paisley in Scotland? They're making muslin, and what happens? It becomes an industrialised process in huge factories, where they end up really making net curtains, not fine muslin. But they were very, very skilled weavers in Paisley and very good at doing fine work. Next one, it became a huge cottage industry in the Vale of Leven around Glasgow. Also mentioned the French who were particularly interested in muslin. They had a basis in Bengal, and then a long time later it became someone set up a sort of cottage industry for farmers to work as weavers in the wintertime down in the Rhone Valley, and they still have every few years they have a muslin festival because it became a huge thing there, huge business, now declined. Next one. So again, what's the importance of these women? They were the kind of fashion leaders of their day who conspicuously wore muslin and promoted it as a fashionable form of dress. So here's a fashion plate in the middle. Here's Marie Antoinette scandalising people by apparently being painted in her underwear rather than proper queenly clothes. And it's a fabric that survives the French Revolution. So you have Empress Josephine wearing it. At one point she had 97 muslin dresses, and they weren't cheap. So next one. What about the future of this handloom? To jump forward, future of handloom and muslin and jamdani, of which you can see 5 recently woven examples here. You've got the problem of westernisation. Are people going to go on wearing saris and their traditional costume, and jamdani, which is the sort of national fabric of Bangladesh? When, you know, we're having heavy promotion of kind of Western styles and people want to be westernised and so on. There are designers, contemporary designers, trying to use jamdani in alternative ways to find new markets. There's Raul Mishra up there. People wearing saris in alternative ways, like this woman in Australia up on the right. There's the problem of cheapened versions. This is really taking the idea of jamdani, the vase of flowers, to extremes at the bottom. There's a very non-traditional sort of probably jacquard woven design. There's the problem of marketing. This is a market for the weekly market for selling jamdani. The whole distribution and economic system on which the weavers depend is very problematic. Problem of how you train the next generation without just resorting to child labour, but you have to start teaching them young. So there are a huge number of problems in keeping this whole business going. Next one, and a lot of livelihoods at stake. These are just put in as kind of typical examples that you find of the kind of problems facing the handloom industry and the decline in the number of handlooms and weavers. And the statistics for the weavers are misleading because it's not just the weaver, it's the people who prepare the yarn and do all the other ancillary activities around it. So one loom employs a lot of people. So if one loom goes, whole family's out of business. Next one. There's a sort of problem of competition from jacquard looms, which produces a very different result and doesn't have the weaver in control of the design in the same kind of way. Here's a picture of abandoned looms, people just not managing to survive. Here's an alternative, working in one of the garment factories in Bangladesh. So these are real problems that have to be addressed at at every level for the weavers. Next one. I've just been to Dhaka, as Saiful and Rini have, for the wonderful Jamdani festival, and here's one example. We weren't allowed to take photos in the exhibition, so I only took one. One of the weavers, they were sponsored to weave very, very high quality Jamdani, which they said at first they couldn't do. So we can't do this, we don't know how, but they were sponsored by different companies and they produced amazing work. This sari took 2 men 20 weeks to weave. There was one sari in the exhibition that took 2 men 8 months to weave. That's working 10 hours a day. So that's the scale of the work and the problem for which they need to be rewarded properly. Next one. So that's it really. Keep the hands moving is my message really, and we all have to find ways of somehow supporting this amazing craft activity. Next one. Oh yes. We have a little project bringing Jamdani to England, stories behind the saris. If you want to know more about it, you can ask us afterwards. Thank you very much.
Can I invite you next?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with another great production of Mohammed Ahmadullah, who single-handedly does these fantastic things for culture in London. So, well done. I'm here, like you, to see Saif's film. So I'm going to speak a little bit about, I suppose, my connection to this, which started about 20 years ago in Dhaka, where myself and my wife Ritu, we were working to improve labour standards in the garment sector, and talking at the inevitable tea break about the history of textiles and the glorious history of Bengal and so on. And the name of the East India Company came up, and I didn't know much about this. And they said, oh yes, East India Company, those are the people who chopped off our weavers' thumbs. And I thought, this is something, I better find out about this. So I came and I turned up in London, and I went to work in the City of London. And in my lunch break, I went to the site of the East India Company headquarters, which is in Leadenhall Street, where the Lloyd's building was. And London being full of history and heritage and nostalgia, I thought there'd be a little blue plaque saying, here was the site of the East India Company, 1648, 1858, the greatest corporation in the world. There was nothing. So from a tea break in Dhaka, where everything was immediate, to nothing in the site of this company, I thought there was something a little bit suspicious, something to find out. And so that led me to write this book with a very bombastic title called The Corporation That Changed the World. Now, Sonia has given us the reason why this company changed the world. If you think about history, sort of the history of global trade from the beginning of time till about sort of 1760, essentially gold and treasure and silver was flooding from west to east, from essentially a relatively undeveloped west to the east to pay for luxury goods. The Romans were complaining about all the bullion which was going to India to pay for these lovely goods. And the East India Company was set up in 1600 as a vehicle for this very, very backward, marginal kingdom called England to get access to these fantastic luxury goods, which we've seen. Originally spice, as Mohammed says, but increasingly these textiles. And so the issue for the East India Company was how would it continue, how could it stop paying silver for all its imports, of which muslin was the most precious. The textiles that came in, we saw that long list, Alibali and all the rest of them, they created this huge lifestyle revolution. If you think that people then in England were wearing basically just wool, the government had to introduce a law to force the shrouds of dead people to be woven in wool because people were so moving to these cotton. And there was a little rhyme going, because the living would not bear it, the dead, when buried, should be forced to wear it. So this created a lifestyle revolution. There were riots, weavers in Leadenhall marched on Parliament and got protection from these imports coming in, all these imports coming in from Bengal. The big difference, and in a sense why, the big turning point was, this wasn't a normal company with shares and boats and factories and so on. It had its private army. And it used its private army at the Battle of Plassey to ensure that it actually could take control of Bengal, this fantastic place where all these textiles came from. And then its big breakthrough came when it took over what was known as Diwani, essentially Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So the company took over the tax base of Bengal. Now imagine what would happen if Exxon took over our inland revenue. What do you think would happen? Would they manage it fairly and administer taxes fairly? Well, of course not. What happened then was what was called the unrequited trade. So imagine you have all that gold, all that silver coming in from London. That stops. The company uses the taxes of Bengal to pay for the textiles of Bengal, and those get shipped out back to London. Unrequited trade. There was nothing in return. And if you go near Liverpool Street, you'll see the old Bengal warehouse where all these textiles were grown. That's when also these tales of the amputations and mutilations of the weavers come from, because the company could control the markets. Previously, actually, the weavers had very good bargaining power, much better conditions than here in England. But now the company was standing alone, it had a monopoly and was able to force down prices. So there are these stories of weavers having been mutilated, their thumbs or fingers being chopped off, but then there are also stories of people also self-mutilation to avoid oppression. And that essentially begins the downward spiral. Behind the trade barriers I mentioned, the industrial revolution grew up here in Britain, mass manufacture of muslins from the 1780s, and then the big change happened in about 1813 when the trade was opened to all. Tariffs went up against Indian goods, and that led largely to the collapse of the textile industry. The company closed its factory in 1818. The population of Dhaka fell from about 150,000 to 20,000 in 20 years. So that's a fairly sad story. What I find so inspiring is the work that so many of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing about your work, about how this lovely craft has continued. Before I hand over, I'd just like to read a poem, if I may, from the poet Shahid Ali, called Dhaka Gauzes. In history, we learned the hands of weavers were amputated, the looms of Bengal silenced, and the cotton shipped raw by the British to England. Sorry, history of little use to her. My grandmother just says how the muslins of today seem so coarse, and that only in autumn, should one wake up at dawn to pray, can one feel that same texture again. Now, the one thing I'd like to correct is actually muslins now are not so coarse. They're actually rather beautiful. So we have progress. Thank you very much.
Rezia.
Yeah. You can hear me. This is I'm quite touched. I'm very touched by both being invited by Ahmadullah, who, as he said at the beginning, I'm not sure how much I helped him, but I know that since I graduated as a hand weaver in 1998, Ahmadullah's always been there. Wherever I've been demonstrating, workshop, exhibition, he's always been there, and I often wondered why. And it's quite apt, and I'm so happy and glad that I heard Sonia and Nick before I'm speaking. My journey to Woven Air began in 1997 when I was an art student learning the technique of hand weaving in Farnham. And I was quite searching for this project, a project that was going to be unique and was going to allow me to grow and research. This was the brief I was given by my tutors. And I was thinking and thinking, nothing came to me. And lots of teachers said to me, what about your background? What about, the clothes that your mom, are you interested in saris, the colours, the beautiful colours of your Bangladesh, where you were born? I was born in Bangladesh. I said, no, I don't want to. I actually want to be me. I want to do something that is unique and different for me. So I went for a walk in the country, in Farnham, and I fell in love with the feeling of the air and light that when I was blowing the dandelion seeds. I should have an image here, but it was far too complicated. So these dandelion seeds is when I felt, that's it. This is what I want to create. I want to create this air, this light air. How do I do that? I took as many of these seeds as I could in my pockets. Of course, they didn't stay the same. And it was Saturday evening. Sunday, I went back with a clear box, plastic clear Ferrero Rocher boxes, there were those. I took to the field and I put as many as I could in there. And I went to my tutorial and I said, this is what I want to capture. They said, oh my goodness, how are you going to, good luck, I was it's very apt that I'm talking about this now. I'm working on a project called the Red Thread, which is, as you may have heard, it's about how it's an ancient Japanese thought about two people coming together by fate and how nothing can stop them from being together. But that's how I feel from the talk I've just heard from both of you and from my journey to Woven Air, that it's a journey that had to be. I had to weave these fabrics and I had to learn about it by myself because the tutors didn't know much about it. Both Sonia and Nick and Saif have just researched and brought everything, I guess, for me as well together. I went to the places, I tread upon the places that Sonia went, and my research as a student was similar but not quite, because I was a student, I didn't go to those places. I wanted to weave with that feeling. Finally, my tutor remembered the exhibition that Sonia touched upon of the catalogue called Woven Air, which was an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, I believe in 1986 or 86. So I went to the gallery and I said, you had this exhibition. Can I see these pieces? Of course, they weren't at the gallery. I then went to the V&A. I went to a lot of the places and felt those fabrics. And again, I felt they were just magic. But how do I produce this magic? Nothing, none of the notations at the V&A told me how to weave these fabrics. I had to figure out by many, many mistakes with fine yarns. There weren't. Bangladesh wasn't accessible. The weavers were not as accessible as your research has made now. So I'm quite interested in sort of finding more out and going. But I'm quite lucky that where I studied, the yarns, there were similar yarns. I weave with a very fine yarn, which is a cotton from Egypt. So through history, the yarn, the thread, the cotton travelled, and Egyptian fine cotton was the one that I felt was the closest to what I wanted to capture. So I do weave, and I did hear stories from a Japanese friend, and I went and read about it, how the fingers were. Sadly, those stories still give me nightmares, and gave me nightmares. And I have to say, I just feel like as if I had to be somehow connected to it through history, through my ancestral heritage that I very much appreciate now. But as an art student, I was just a British art student wanting to make that difference with my artwork, and that's how I became a weaver with fine yarns. I'll pass you over to Saiful because, as I say, I do feel very honoured to be here, and I feel very honoured to be weaving in the way that I do, and very blessed. And I hope that you can see some of my pieces in a book that I will pass on when Saif's film finishes. But the main reason we're here for is Saif's film.
Thank you.
Just one thing, I don't believe the British cut off tongues and thumbs to destroy the industry. Those days people were cutting tongues and heads off, right, on little things. So I'm sure the British did cut some people's hands off, but not to destroy the industry. Right.
All right, but Rezia's got a thumbs on, right? Yeah, great. Thank you, Ahmadullah, and thank you everybody for being here this evening. I don't want to stand between you and the film, and I understand that after the film there will be an opportunity to ask questions and answers also, so perhaps we'll be able to continue over there. Very briefly, my journey which led to this film and the ongoing work that I'm doing at the moment did start with the two people over there on the right, which is Sonia and Ahmadullah. This was about 2013, and Ahmadullah had already done a piece of work which hasn't been mentioned up till now, but from the villages of Bengal that you spoke about, Muslin. I was at that time in Bangladesh being the CEO of an organization called Drik that some of you may have heard of, which has been engaged often in bringing stories of Bangladesh that we believe are important and authentic. It's not propaganda, it's about what one could perceive has been lost over a period of time. And when Ahmadullah approached me about the work that they'd done about Muslin, I felt that there was something that could be added to it. What I did not realize at that time was that the spread of Muslin is not simply geographical. the spread of muslin actually goes beyond that, beyond culture, beyond colonialism, beyond economics, into issues of identity, into heritage, And so therefore, to me, what started out as a journey looking for a fine fabric ended up with trying to actually reclaim not only the fabric, but reclaim our history. Because to me, it felt that the book of 1851, which is a beautiful book, and the subsequent articles and so on, hadn't done justice to the true heroes of that fabric, which are the weavers, which are the people who had actually sacrificed and who had given this fabric to the world. So I started out by going around to similar places. Sonia gave me so much information. Ahmadullah gave it to me. I went to the British Library, the British Museum, the Bath Museum, everywhere, Jane Austen's place to see the muslin. And then I broadened my research. I went to Turkey, I went to Switzerland, I went to Germany, Italy, the States, and so on. And eventually I hit the rivers of Bangladesh because I felt that only over there would I be able to feel a connection between that special climate and this special textile. And from there, I thought that how is it that our story has up till now not been told by us to an extent? Why is it that we have not been able to do that? And for a variety of reasons, obviously, this has happened. So it is important that I try and find that connection. So therefore, I went from a period of familiarization to a period of almost conversion. And then came the challenge that would it remain just a legend locked up, like behind historical doors, or would we be able to bring it out into the open, into the daylight, bring that skill back? And therefore, our weavers in Bangladesh had gone down to something like 40 count or 60 count, quite coarse, in Jamdanis, 80, even 100, who had never gone above that for a variety of reasons. We decided to challenge them. And we wove for the first festival that we had 300 count for the first time, and eventually we went to 400. The 400 was actually in the Manchester Woodward Museum. So what you see over here are some of the samples that we have done for the festival and even later. And to put it all together, we thought that it was important that the country should hear about it, should know about it, not only the current generation, but the future generations, which is why the book and even the graphic novel has come out. The last part of it was that, obviously, the message is in the medium, and the film appeared to be one way of actually showing it, and it has been, up till now, happily quite popular. I love showing it to, especially the younger generations, universities, and so on. So it has been shown there. And as I say, this is an attempt not simply to highlight a fabric or simply about the journey that we have made, but to bring together the different strands around this fabric and to give it a depth and to give it a respect that we believed it deserved. So I'll end over there, and I'm sure we'll take more questions after the film show. Is that right?
Thank you.
It was something, as they say, spun from our breath and woven from our heart.
Muslin's been a part of our heritage for a very long time. Something that we lost eventually.
It wasn't just the Mughal emperor, you have the courtiers. And later on it continued with the East India Company.
The price of muslin was set by the company 2 years in advance, and therefore at the actual time of purchase, the weaver would be losing. The thumbs of weavers were cut and dropped over here. This is possibly one of the last pieces of muslin that was woven in Bengal.
We hope that through our story, we will turn the lens around.
Drik, Sonia, Rezia.
Thank you, everybody. Just very briefly, let me also thank a lot of the people who were involved. First of all, Nita, she's over there. That's the lovely voice that you hear during the narration. Nita, and then there are others. My wife really actually had the lights at one stage. She still says she's unpaid labor. And of course, many over here and beyond in Bangladesh, in other countries, and sponsors also at the time, BRAC, the ministry, all of you brought together, very quickly in order to put that film together. So I hope you liked it, and we'll now take any questions that are there, and I'm sure the whole panel over here can probably answer some of those questions if there are any in your mind.
He's got a microphone, so he can come to you.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that the finest Muslin was 400 count? No? What was it?
I think so.
So the question is...
So Sonia would be probably even a better expert.
The question is, now that the original plant is extinct, how close can you get today to the finest Muslin that was available?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of the information is kind of shrouded in history, but I myself have seen examples, and this is not saying that I actually took the thread out for doing it, but in comparison, when I saw it, I would say easily that would be of 600 count that was there. And then as the film mentions over here, there are stories which say that the count went up to 900, 1,000, and even in one particular village, and this is in a book in Bangla, which was written in 1962 by Professor Karim, where he mentions this particular village, where he says it went up to 1150 or 1200. I went to that village, and people over there were watching television, and they were like, don't remember anything like that, all right? Which is not surprising at all, because this is mentioned like perhaps somewhere in the region of about 200 plus years ago. So it would go much higher than 400 count. When we attempted to resurrect that textile, we saw that in Bangladesh, there was, in about 2013, 100 count probably was the maximum that was being made at that time. And Ahmadullah himself had started, I think you were at somewhere around 84 or something like that. And 100 had been attempted. Somebody had done a small piece of 120 count. Now, roughly speaking, Muslin would be categorized as such by like 250 and above. So our intention was to break through that envelope, or break through that kind of, shall I say, barrier that was there. And so we went for 300 count, and that is actually what we produced. Subsequent to that, we actually produced 400 count. And when I say 400 count, this is not plain muslin, this is one with motifs in it. So we have the 200, the 300, the 400, and currently we are attempting, and I'm only saying attempting because we've been doing it for the last 3 months, about 500 count. This is from yarn that has been spun in India. And obviously this yarn is not made of the original putti karpa, which is extinct. So a separate line of activity for us has been to get samples of cotton plants, grow them near riverbanks, take that and have the DNA analyzed, which we have done. And one of them has come to about 70% match. So it's not a question of, I feel or I think, but this is DNA analysis, which was done in 2 institutions, one in the UK and one in the US. So 70% is a pretty good match for us, and that's what we heard. So we matched them against the samples in the Kew Gardens and in Kolkata. And we have introduced that cotton into the yarn on a very limited scale, because the minute we introduce a bit of it, the yarn starts to behave not very well. So we've tried to introduce that. So our intention is that ultimately if we can get this cotton to be introduced in larger quantities in the yarn and to try and do that spinning of a high count, I would be extremely delighted if we could achieve 500 count, because I think that would have established a benchmark for our country.
aspect of that is that the Victorians, who were very keen on measuring and cataloguing and getting everything sort of down in registered, as it were, they attempted to, when they had machine spinning and machine weaving, they attempted to replicate Indian muslin, partly because they wanted to flood the Indian market. But although, and they wanted to get it as fine as the Bengal muslin. And so technically they achieved this in terms of being able to measure it scientifically, but it just didn't feel the same as the hand woven. They could never achieve that particular soft, wearable quality. They used a different type of cotton yarn to start with, American cotton that had longer fibres and was suited to machinery, and the British machinery couldn't use this Indian fibres. And they just could never match the quality of that Bengal muslin in feel, although technically it was as fine.
What's the concept of
okay, so as it's evident that I cannot get hold of that, and I wasn't trying to imitate that. I wanted to produce that dandelion feeling. I actually use a silk from China, which is straight from the cocoon, almost absolutely invisible to the eye, on my weft. So it's just straight from the cocoon, and the gum, the natural gum is still there. I cannot cultivate it here, unfortunately, so I do have a supplier from China, and the Egyptian cotton is very, very fine, and it's 300 count, and I went to Egypt to see and have a village directly where I have managed to get quite a lot. And because I need very, very little of the yarn, because I use a small amount, because it is very fine, so I don't need much, and I managed to buy quite a lot of this sort of yarns when I went to Egypt and Japan and China.
your hijab? Did you make it?
I did. This was act, you know. So we've known each other for a long time, and then somehow Saif, before his research, he found out about me and went to my studio and encouraged me to produce some samples that he can then take to Bangladesh and see if they can weave what I have produced. So this was a sample design that I did. Yeah, Saif has always encouraged, and I feel sort of he wants me to be this contemporary designer who is one day I hope to use these yarn threads, you know, yarns. I'm just absolutely waiting for that moment.
Well, actually, one of the reasons that I felt so close to what Rezia was doing was because I believed that muslin shouldn't be just locked up as some sort of a historical item, you know, that it existed in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. It has no role in today's fashions. So therefore, when we held the festival, we invited designers to actually take the fabric and to use their imagination in any way that they felt like. Rezia was one of the designers, and her dresses were shown along with other designers from India, the UK, and Bangladesh. Some did saris, some did skirts, some did gowns. There was also men's clothing that was done. So the whole attempt was to bring muslin out of the history books and into the current scenario. And I believe that people like Rezia are absolutely important to that journey.
Nick, would you like to say anything? We'll go to the next question.
I have a sociological question. How did religion come into the division of labor? I believe what you understood that the weavers were Muslims and the spinners were Hindus. How did that happen?
Okay, I'll have a go at it, and probably Sonia will definitely be able to add to that. There were apparently divisions of labor and skill, not only along religious lines, but also along caste lines, along gender lines. So there were certain tasks which were performed better by women, and certain tasks performed better by men, which is quite traditional in many industries. And then again, there would be ones that would be done by communities that had developed special skills. When I said that the spinning was done, it was essentially done by Hindus, and that was because I think the women over there specifically had that ability to just do that yarn far better and lived along those places where the yarn was done far better than the Muslims did. Muslim women didn't seem to play much of a part in the spinning or even in the weaving. In terms of weaving, when it was plain, and that exists to this day, so as a kind of supplementary support, let's say, when I go to India, I find that a lot of the muslin, so-called muslin that they have over there, which is high count, no doubt about it, is plain. They do very little motifs in India. So the plain muslin was often done by the Hindus, whereas the figured and the flowered one, which probably has its antecedents in the Persian tradition, which came with the Mughals, the flowered and the figured, that was done by the Muslims. Also, you do hear, and this is from another friend, Paolo Manfredi, that the needlework that was done was essentially done by Muslims, because evidently the needles came from Basra and so on, places like that. So they played a role in terms of doing needlework. Hindus didn't specifically like that much of the needlework to be done. So you get these different ones, and even we showed, I think, the needlework being done by that person who would take one thread out of a sari and put it back in again, and that was a specific community. And these communities used to be, I would say, guarded their secrets to some extent, or their skill to some extent, okay? And therefore it would be happening that there were something like around 16 different pockets of skill along these gender, religion, and caste lines that happened.
Firstly, I want to congratulate you for holding this event. And we didn't know about, I didn't know, I live in London, I didn't know about the Bengal History Week. And I'm going to make sure that I remember to put it in my diary.
When we started, we've got another more events, right? So it's good to see you.
But, so firstly, okay, so I'll start with Rezia. How moving is your story? And it seems like almost an epiphany that you wanted to weave air without really going back to your traditions, and it connected you to your tradition. But there's two questions that I have. I too grew up with the romance of Muslin, particularly in my maternal side of my family, who were from the UP, and there they called the best muslin, it was Dhaka Malmal, but it was called Nensuk, that which gave pleasure, at least to the eyes. But of course it's a luxury item, and I'm very interested to hear that there's a revival. So I grew up with my mother wearing Dhaka Jamdani saris, and I would, I think, share some examples with you, which are of a fairly fine count from the 50s and the 60s. But the history of that, of course, was that we were in an almost colonial relationship, living in West Pakistan, and my mother's saris came, her Jamdani saris came from Dhaka, and she was boasting to a Bengali friend of hers, an East Pakistani friend at that time, and said, I, throughout summer, wear Jamdani. So the Bengali lady turned around and she said, of course, you can afford to wear it, okay? Because also jamdani is very, very high maintenance. So who does the kata and so on now? Because I remember that Amma's sarees used to be sent specially back to Dhaka to be washed, because they couldn't be washed in West Pakistan. So how is that economy, going to? But of course, bravo, and they're luxury items, and they should be. The second comment that I have, or question: why is in all the presentations? I'm a historian. So why is the impact of the actually colonial pillage of the textile industry somehow sanitized in your presentations? It was awful. It destroyed generations of livelihoods. It destroyed a way of life, or different ways of life, and also, that you're pointing out about Hindu and Muslim weavers and craftsmen working together. It destroyed all of that. So I am not sure about this beautiful, sort of image of the change and the transition and the death, partial death at one time, of the textile industry. And I think that we need to face up to it, so that we make sure that in the modern and contemporary corporations and multinationals, this is not, this doesn't continue to happen. And I think William Dalrymple's book is quite timely, but I think he also sanitizes it a bit. It was pretty darn awful, and I think we need to say it. But well done and long live, and may we all be able to have at least one beautiful jamdani in our collections. Thank you.
About the maintenance of jamdani, because this is a question that I was asked only last month when during the Jamdani festival. Women came up, and I think partly that answer might be even amongst the ladies from Bangladesh over here. It is one of probably the most difficult part of the jamdani, having a jamdani in your collection, because the motifs over there, if they go through the rigor of a washing process, then the motifs will actually, get distorted and therefore destroy the sari. And it is true that jamdani has to be doesn't have to be washed, it has to be dipped, and then once it is taken out and dried, it has to be repositioned, the motifs. Not every one of them, but some of them which have moved. So that's the way to do it at the moment, and unfortunately that process is done best at a weaver's location. So most people, they turn it over to a laundry in Bangladesh, but that laundry will never wash it. They immediately give it to a weaver, and the weaver will take it and take the whole sari, just dip it in, take it out, with a very low soap that they use, and then they reposition, which is the kata, which is what they do. Beyond that, dry clean is sometimes done, and there are one or two dry cleaners who don't do a bad job of it, but I doubt if they have ever done high count, because remember that the jamdani is not very high count all the time. So it is one of the issues. However, I've seen the jamdani once worn is worn again and again and again, and probably 3-4 years, because it is done on special occasions, not on a daily basis. It does do without a proper wash like that for probably a few years, and then it goes to the weaver. Again, that process is followed. On the second one, before I hand over to Nick, the only thing I'd say is that we do in the film talk about English plunder. So we were very upfront about what we thought happened in that particular period, and try and cover some parts of it during the film. But I'll hand it over to Nick. I think you can give a more detailed response.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And with Brick Lane Circle, I often give walks around London, and took William Dalrymple on one of those where he got a lot of the themes for his book. I think one of the things which is interesting is the myth in the UK that we grew rich on the back of free trade, and that was not true. So I think in a sense what happened was in the film and so on, is that actually there were trade barriers, very high trade barriers to protect the textile industry areas. Behind those that we have the Industrial Revolution and so on. And what I found interesting when I was writing the book about 10 years ago was how Adam Smith, who was seen as this great proponent of free markets, he actually added an extra section to his Wealth of Nations because of the behavior of the East India Company, and sort of beware of these corporations. He liked free trade, but that was not what the East India Company was doing. So that was one of the things I think that, as I say, that inspired me was the sort of, in a sense, invisibility of this story in the UK. I think what I've seen over the last 10, 15 years is how that story is becoming more visible. And I think that is good, perhaps because generations are passing and we can look at this more open-eyed and so on. But I think it's particularly important for this country, I mean, the story of Muslin, the great beauty of this, and to be aware of that relationship. Maybe for another time we could talk about the other history, the relationship with China and opium. I don't think that's for another time.
I just wanted to add something to this, which relates to what you were saying. When I started studying weaving, which was in 1997, what I found, the word weaving was not in our vocabulary. What Gandhi did was not known by everyone. Forget about colonization, you know, what the British did. I was sort of, I stood up like a sore thumb when I was studying and my mission was to revive the tradition of weaving in British contemporary world of arts. And that's how I went then into researching and my heritage. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of world heritage. There's been a lot of untold stories of craft, and we need to revive a lot more than Bengal history has. You know, I think it's great that this happens, but we need platforms and we need this sort of events to be a example and do a lot more. So thank you to Ahmadullah for being a great example.
Did you want to come back?
We reached the end of our time, I'm afraid.
You got up to 9:30.
9 o'clock.
See there. It's got 9:30.
Such a big information, sorry.
Really. But always in that publicity 9:30. They don't have it.
It's 9:30
Okay, last question from you.
Okay, who will do it? Last question from Tony. Sorry, John.
The mic.
I just want to throw in two quick ones. They may be connected. I'm John Baker. I live in East London, a couple of stones throw now, because I'm old, from the East India Dock location. It's one thing, it is quite disgusting to me, in the light of all I've learned in the last decade of Bengal, that companies widely publicize, let's bring back the glory of past days to the East India area in East London. And I am affronted by this because the East India era in India plundered India and Bengal for the sake of an industrial revolution which is now crushing us. However, that's the end of my political speech. Not quite the end of passion, though. I have become involved in a practical way in some folk and traditional arts and crafts of Bengal. Quite clearly there's an association between Muslim weavers and the region in which they weave. So a question, not quite the last, how do you see the connection between a high standard of craft production by individual workers as actually comprising the strength of that community from the past and into the future. The second one is a bit more difficult because I've come up against something else, which is muslins are not the only high quality, exceptional, world quality woven fabrics that come from Bengal. On the eastern side of Bengal there are smaller communities, perhaps if we go to the hill tracts or a little to the east of Sylhet, and find that there are communities quite identified, very together, very protective of what they have, and yet they seem to be under considerable pressure of losing their land and their opportunities and their trade, not from world change in mechanization, but actually from the lodging of their own government of very large numbers of troops. Now, I'm trying very hard to state the facts as I've understood them from research and from people I know in that territory, and yet not engage in the internal business and politics of a country which is not my own. But I'm talking about woven fabrics which are of outstanding quality, and we do look like not only are we going to lose the fabrics, the tradition, but also the people.
Here.
This film was about the historical fame of a Bengal textile that related to the East India Company's operation and what it brought. Even and because muslin was always talked about and was highly regarded. When I was looking at East India Company records, even K.N. Chaudhary's book, his book is quite highly regarded, it's the British Library. He identifies more than 40 different types of textile that came from Bengal alone, through East India Company. And about 10 of them were classified as different kind of muslin. Then there were textiles coming from Gujarat and so on. In Bengal, the Hijra hill tracts and Sylhet, Manipuri, they were not included as seen as Bengali, and were not imported historically by the East India Company in the number, they did. Because this project was focusing on this East India Company and then the European historical links, with our textile, that's why this is the focus. But I have seen, I've been to Hijra hill tracts. I've seen people weaving. I took photographs and I bought materials as well. They're really, really wonderful, and I've been to their festivals and see how they dress and project themselves with their fabrics, and that was really kind of beautiful.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I think one of the problems that you're referring to is that crafts are not seen by the present government in India as part of the project of modern India. They're sort of marginalised, and this is apart from attitudes towards minority peoples. I don't really want to go into all that. At the symposium at the Jamdani Festival I attended recently in Dhaka, there was a very interesting discussion about the fact that handloom weavers and the people who are dependent on them and involved in production are not adequately recognised in the census data in India. So they might count number of handlooms, but that doesn't account for the number of people involved in the actual craft. So there's no realistic estimate of the economic contribution of weavers, for one thing. And the person who was discussing this was urging the Bangladeshi government to sit up and take note of this, because it was if people aren't recognised as being economically important, they'll just be sort of swept away and there will be no assistance for them. And what's happening in India is that a number of handloom weavers are now living below the poverty line. They can't, they're just not, it's not working for them. So they need to be recognised as contributing economic units, if you like.
Yeah.
That's what I learned.
I mean, that's absolutely valid what Alhamdulillah and Sonia have mentioned. I think the first part of your question, or the first question that you spoke about, is that maintaining standards of weaving going forward and so on, like that, something around that, as I grasped it. And that has been a major challenge because of the industrial productions of saris and industrial productions that have happened of other textiles. The pressure on the handloom industry, as shown in one of the graphs that Sonia showed, the decline over there, was enormous. And I think the response of the weavers has been very traditional in terms of producing even cheaper jamdanis and introducing silk and viscose and so on into that. I think the strength of jamdani as being one of the finer niche products that people will be looking for should be maintained, and that is why the thrust of our work and the Jamdani Festival has been about bringing back that niche strength. Even though I agree that it is a luxury, but at the end of the day, the brands, and as I said, arguably Muslin was probably the first global brand because everybody knew it as such. So the strength of the brand would be increased by having something which is unachievable by others. And that is the reason why we're trying to reposition that. Instead of trying to fight the cost war and try and bring down the cost every time, try and fight it at the luxury level, at the niche level, and try and improve the branding of it. And today, when we look at the number of weavers in the Jamdani Festival, there are probably about, I would say probably 30 of them over there. And when we started out in 2013, we could only get one or maybe two who would do that. So there is that slight enhancement of the group, and the confidence in the weavers is there that we can do 200, we can do 300, or they said, bring it on, let's try even better ones. So there is that part of it which needs to be encouraged, and of course what Sonia mentioned about recognition and remuneration, both of them are important. I think the second one about the army presence that you mentioned, something about army presence in the hill tracts and in Sylhet and so on, these areas. When searching for muslin, we did go to the hill tracts. I went and I collected samples, I collected textiles. I went to Sylhet, I went to Assam, because those are the sources of the Meghna, the river Meghna, and collected over there also. I must say that the textiles over there that I found were very different, and the strength of them seemed to be more in the design and in the color, and in some of the unique ways that they had spun it, especially using the waist loom that they do, but not in terms of high count. Perhaps that had not yet, that had not survived over there. But certainly it was in high count, where it was the strength of it was a different, was the design and the kind of colors that they were using over there was very important. And of course, this issue of, as you say, the government presence over there and all the political problems, that is a hindrance to the craft. I agree that.
The last word from Nick, and then
over to you.
Well, I think this idea of luxury is really interesting, actually. And the story, listening particularly to the film and to Sonia and Rezia, is here actually is an example where technological progress does actually not lead to cultural progress very clearly in terms of actually the quality of the cloth and so on. So it's a very interesting story for us sometimes. We generally think that more technology is better, and this is clearly a case where that's not the case. And I think this question of luxury making me reflect, because in a sense, how could this wonder be more democratized? How can it be more available to all? So it's not just reliant on the Mughals or today's Mughals, but actually how can this wonder be more available to all? So I think that would be something I'd like to finish on.
I just want to say that this is such an important research that Saif has produced, and coming back to how what happened, like I as a maker would not have been able to go and do the research that Saif has done, and it's important to collect the diversity of having the sort of the weavers speak the weavers have to, I just feel as a weaver that they should have a say as well to what it is that they want. Do they want to be the weavers who weave luxurious fabrics? Do they want to do this? And where do they want their work to go? Clearly they want an income, like I do, and I don't. And even, as a contemporary British weaver, I don't have the respect that Saif and Sonia have given. Overall, I would like more recognition, and I'm sure they would as well.
Thank you very much. Before I finish, just want to share something with you. When I went to the Jamdani Kulli to order some materials for our project here, and one of the guy was telling us, explaining the cost, of different quality of Jamdani. And he said last year this minister ordered the Jamdani for Sheikh Hasina, and it cost 75,000 taka. Right? But then you can also buy for maybe 1,000 taka. No, 1,000 taka. Yeah, 1,500 taka. Right? You could buy. Just one thing, this is the first day of Bengal History Week. The program is a leaflet there. Please take and do come. We got many interesting events next week and week after. And I'm giving a talk on the 16th. It's a unique subject. Not many people in our community know. I just come back from the original Spice Island, for some nutmeg. So if anybody comes, they will get a nutmeg. From the original island, right? The book is free over there. Can you take the food, please? I can't take all of the book. And there's another book by Saif, and he's selling that. That book is free, but he's selling that one.
Muslin's been a part of our heritage for a very long time.